go to the next slide, please, Rosie. Thank you. No, I was really chuffed that Dan asked me to do this piece, and mainly because it's a bit of it's something that's fairly close to my heart, and it's something that I think in the world of crisis management, it's something that we often overlook, is that post-crisis analysis, and we do that at our peril, you know, especially, and what concerns me even more is a crisis such as the COVID-19 pandemic, which is, you know, long, drawn out and highly effective, means that we're drawn into the response and recovery phases for a long period of time, almost creating a new normal. And it's very easy suddenly to forget and move on, and not just look back and work out the lessons that we could have learned from that for future crises. Albeit that we could argue that the crisis is far from over, we shouldn't avoid taking stock and looking back on how we manage a crisis and how we can improve things. Having looked at this and done some research, my initial analysis, and actually having spoken to a number of clients and been involved at different levels of crisis management throughout the pandemic, I think the overriding observation for me is that actually we don't need to rewrite the crisis handbook, you know, the way we manage a crisis. Our crisis management plans should always be simple and flexible enough to accommodate any kind of crisis. However, that still doesn't mean to say that we manage these crises well. And I think that, again, things that I saw that were clear and evident throughout the current pandemic is our lack of speed to respond, our inability to quickly innovate, you know, and the frustrations that created. So that then got me to ask the question, so why is this? If we still think our crisis plans are intact and extant in our approach to crisis management, you know, we don't need to change the rule book, then why is it then we are always slow to respond, or we're sometimes not innovative enough? So I came to the conclusion it's really a human factor, and some of the points that have already been raised here about, you know, frustrations of frustrations in managing people and how to get people to be involved clearly points to a human level. So what I did to do is start to look at how a crisis management then in these kind of scenarios affects us at a human level, which in turn affects us at organizational level, and indeed almost up to government level as well, indeed at government level. Next slide, please, Rosie. So I started to look at something called the Kubler-Ross curve. I mean, some of you may well be familiar with the Kubler-Ross curve. It was initially, it was a process that was devised in the late 60s by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross to map the phases of morale and emotions that patients go through when they've been diagnosed with a life-limiting disease. And then it's very often used as well to map the stages of grief. And more recently, we see it used quite a lot as well in change management. And I think it actually sits quite nicely as well in the world of crisis management. You know, if your definition of a crisis is something that cannot be contained by normal SOPs or is not business as usual, well, there's no more greater change in a major crisis. So how is that likely to affect us at a human level, and how does that affect our ability to manage a crisis? And as you see on the Kubler-Ross curve, generally speaking, this affects most people, but to different levels of extent. And I think it's really important to understand what it is that you're going through emotionally during a crisis. What is your leadership going through? And indeed, what are your subordinates going through? And certainly I've taken to having this on the second page of my one-page crisis management plan, is I have the Kubler-Ross curve, just as an everyday reminder of how we should be managing ourselves and the people around us. So, I mean, if we start off at the curve, you know, like I say, everyone is different, and everyone's ability to speed through this curve is different, and the dips and troughs are different. And what we should be doing as an organization is actually trying to flatten the curve, and also, which is obviously a phrase we're all familiar with, but flatten that curve, but also reduce the timeline from that period of shock to the period of acceptance and integration. So if you look at the early stages of this, it doesn't matter who you are and how well prepared you are, there'll always be a period of shock, that initial rabbit in the headlights of something's happening, and that initial position where, you know, of confusion and lack of understanding. And quite often, you know, this doesn't really affect us too much, and actually morale can go up as we start to go into the denial phase. You know, and certainly for me, observing some of the institutions I've been working with, you know, certainly in the early days of the COVID crisis, a lot of people considered this to be a China thing. It was an Asia thing. It was never going to affect Europe to the extent it has. Certainly wasn't going to affect America to the state it has. And if you look at the new cases and the death toll, you know, America's ranked #1. Europe is currently got 7 countries out of the top 10 that have got most affected. And we never would have thought back in January that we were going to be affected. And we were clearly in a level of denial. We were also looking at previous outbreaks of MERS, H1N1 and SARS, and just, well, they were very regional. They won't affect us. So morale goes up a little bit as we're in denial. Then obviously things start to dawn upon us and we go into that level of frustration and depression. And especially, you know, if you look at your own businesses, you'll be thinking about, well, I was just about to launch this major project. I was just about to get funding in. I was just about to recruit 10 new people to support me on this project. And they then start to become the gravitational pull away from actually managing the crisis. So it's really important to understand that this is what's happening to the people around you. And then eventually we'll start to pull ourselves through this and we start to experiment with the new ideas. We start to approach the new normal and then start integrating those new ideas. But obviously our ability to go from that shock to integration needs to be as quick and slick as possible. So how do we do that? Next slide, please. Thank you. So what I've tried to do is overlay some good guidance, and being a good, proud former Royal Marine, I thought I'd overlay the commando mindset of being the first to understand, the first to adapt and respond, and the first to overcome, which, you know, has stood me good stead over the years. So the first phases of this, you know, what does it mean to be the first to understand? Well, this is all about your intelligence gathering and your information capturing. You know, look at everything that's available to you. Don't just look at the John Hopkins site and start looking at all the data. No, start to ask yourself the question, so what? And in the early days, if all of us were subscribing to the John Hopkins data, it was all Asia, 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 broken down by cities, and that made us feel comfortable. We weren't asking that, well, what if this now turns on its head and goes to Europe? What if this does start to spread across the US? And how would that affect the way we operate? And asking the question of so what? So like I say, it's being the first to understand. Don't just make assumptions, capture that data and start asking questions. And it might not be enough information for you to start responding immediately, but what you can do is start to create smaller teams to start investigating the what if scenarios. What if it does affect Europe? What if it does affect the Middle East? So that you at least start scoping it out in advance. And then as obviously the crisis progresses and we go into this position of frustration, which again, as I said, affects us all, this is where your strong leadership comes into play. Now, this is the time where you're going to have to start pulling people away from the projects they would normally be dealing with. Indeed, you're going to have to start making some really tough decisions about furlough, laying people off, and changing the strategy of the business. And this is where strong visual leadership is paramount to get you through this next phase. Because without that, you're going to delay that ability to start experimenting and innovating and then going on to overcoming the scenario. And when it comes to overcoming the scenario, it's about embracing that change. You know, what got you to where you are today won't get you there tomorrow during a major crisis. You know, looking back to the Marines when they were at Jugram Fort, you may have heard the story where they had a soldier that was left behind, and they quickly ascertained the only way to get this guy out was to tie people to the outside of a helicopter. There is nothing in the rule book for that, but they quickly came to the fact that this is the least worst option. And there's nothing in the new rule book that includes that. So again, they had to innovate and embrace change very, very quickly. And they realized what didn't work in the past might not apply in the future. And this also goes, this backward looking as well can also affect your ability to make decisions. I heard time and time again during crisis calls that this will all be over by August. You know, we'll be over this by the end of the year because we got through 9/11. We got through the financial crisis. It lasted us about 5 months and then we rebound. You know, the rebound will definitely be a V-shaped rebound because it was after 9/11 and it was after the financial crash. Neither of these apply. You know, this is a global pandemic, but people were reaching back to previous examples and finding comfort in them. So they were then at denial phase. So if you had to take three things away from this particular slide is Understand that everybody suffers from shock in the first instance. Everybody will go through a level of denial. And the most important thing is to go to that level of acceptance and integration. Next slide, please. So how do we keep things simple and how do we keep ourselves on track? As Dan said, you know, we can all have these very highly complex and well thought out and crafted, beautiful crisis plans. But if you can't have if you can't get your response plan onto a single page that everyone can understand, you're going to be struggling. So keep yourself process led, maintain simple frameworks, remain flexible, understand that no two crises are the same. Even if the scenarios are the same, there's never, ever two crises the same. They'll always throw different aspects at you. You know, and obviously we always hope for the best, but always prepare for the worst. And when you do your analysis as well, or your post-crisis analysis, don't concentrate purely on what was your response. Go back through your phases, you know, and analyze your level of preparation. Analyze your level of prevention. What prevention strategies could you have had in place? You know, what preparation strategies could you add in place before you start to look at your response? Also look at what point did you actually invoke your crisis management team? Now, I would always say that, and you know, this is a simple crisis cycle that certainly we use at Spearfish, but there is there is a transition phase that goes from your preparatory phase to your crisis response. And that is always an emerging scenario. And I'm a massive advocate of setting up your crisis team early. Get your crisis team early and start warming up the wheels. Don't wait until you start to be affected before you then pull your team together, because the effects of shock and denial will be far greater if you can start. But if you can start to ease people into a crisis, the earlier the better. And one thing on the prevention as well, though, I'm just be mindful that, you know, and I'm sure people will ask the question is how can we prevent a pandemic? This is actually one of the crises that is potentially really, really unusual. Having spoken to people in the UK government that were dealing in or work closely with COBRA, and when they tabletop exercise a major pandemic, it certainly went into that top right-hand corner of a risk profile, and it indeed almost became that too difficult to manage. You know, because to truly be able to have a prevention strategy to counter a major pandemic, you would have to have permanently set up Nightingale wards. You'd have to have permanently set up storage facilities for PPE that all cost millions of pounds. And indeed, you'd have to have complete infringements on movement of people and data privacy. You know, and we saw in China how they were very effective at managing the crisis, but because they were able to impinge upon people's personal lives and their own data protection. So they were able to track and trace, if you like, very, very effectively. Next slide, please, Rosie. And something else that we should be mindful of as well is crisis recovery. The one thing I noticed throughout this pandemic crisis was people staying too long in the response mode. And that was, and I think Dan mentioned it before about this gravitational pull towards tactical planning. You know, you need to start pulling yourself away, especially leaders. And it's our job in a crisis management team to try and push the leadership into being more strategic. We seek comfort on managing small tactical issues because we feel we're taking steps forward, but actually we need to be able to take that step back. And recovery is an important part of crisis management, but again, it often gets left to the end. And my guidance to the crisis leaders is allocate a crisis recovery team now, even on the first call. Get them to sit to one side and start to identify what recovery looks like for your organization. Don't wait until you stop responding to start recovering, because by waiting, putting your recovery off, by definition, you're stretching out your period of response. I saw too many institutions in the response phase for far too long before they started to look after recovery. And have a marketing plan. It doesn't matter that you're not in FMCG or normal manufacturing or those kind of products. Everyone on this call has got a brand, either a personal brand or a business brand, and make sure that you can communicate that you're back stronger and more resilient. Final slide, next slide, please, Rosie. To try and encapsulate all of that last slide, you know, and a metaphor that I often use when I'm working with crisis teams is just think of it as a running race. Now you can know that there's a race about to start, i.e. you can see a pandemic starting in China. It may or may not affect you. You can either sit at home with your trainers in the cupboard, eating your Doritos and drinking Coca-Cola, or you can get the bus to the running track, get on the running track, get limbered up, and then even better, rather than wait for the race to start, get on the track and start getting ahead of it. And it's a simple analogy, but it works very well and it translates very well. You know, be there, get there early and get ahead, you know, and then your decision making will be easier and your ability to respond will be easier. And last slide. And finally, everyone's aware of this, certainly everybody from a military heritage, but it's so true. Plans are worthless, you know, but planning is everything. Again, you can have, like I say, Dan said quite eloquently about having a well-crafted plan that's been, you know, poured over for days and days by your security team. It means nothing unless you get to sit around the table, you know, get that one-page response plan and pour over the decision making. And indeed, you know, as I do now, you know, have a look at that Kubler-Ross curve, understand how it's going to affect you as an individual, your leadership, your subordinates, and you as an institution. And that's all I have, but I'm willing to take any questions or open it up to comment and discussion.